It's been said that life is a series of good stories and bad stories, and that everything depends on any good story, bad story, on how the story ends. If it's a bad ending, then it's a bad story. But if it's a good ending, then it's a great story. And today, in this message, we're looking at a great ending to a very, very good story. We're concluding a series titled Becoming an Overcomer. And in this series, we've been looking at a variety of ways in which the life of David demonstrates good stories and bad stories, and how David becomes an overcomer over all of those stories through the power and the anointing and the leadership of God himself. I'm Stu Bamick, and I'm a part of a ministry called Consequential Christianity. We're trying our best to understand all of life from God's perspective. And in the process of that, we've been looking at how God brings this process of overcoming into our lives through people like David. Now, today's story is about a fellow by the name of Mephibosheth. To understand Mephibosheth, we have to do a little bit of the backstory. We have to do the prequel. As you'll recall, David killed this giant Goliath, and after he did, God found favor with him, and David had success in all that he did. But this only enraged King Saul. He was jealous, he was angry, he was afraid of the power that the people were giving to David. Conversely, Saul's son Jonathan, who is the heir apparent to the throne, loves David. He knows that one day David will sit in his seat, and one day David's going to wear his crown on his head. But their souls are knit together into one spirit. They love each other and they love their God. And over the course of time, if anyone had a reason to hate David, it would have been Jonathan, but he didn't. Where Saul fights for the crown, Jonathan opens up and releases and gives the crown to David. Now that's where I want us to pick up this story today. So the story does pick up earlier in the prequel or the backstory with a passage that we read in this series, several messages earlier. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 15, we read these words. This is the conversation between David and Jonathan. Do not cut off, Jonathan says, your steadfast love from my house forever. Your kesed, remember those Hebrew verbs, kesed, your loyalty, your trust, your devotion to me. Don't cut that off from my house forever. For the Lord cuts off every one of his enemies of David. When the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth, don't cut me off. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, a berith, a promise. Remember, the promise-keeping part of relationships leads to the trust-keeping part. Now, here's what's happening. Jonathan is saying, look, my father is seeking to kill you. He wants to obliterate you. He wants to wipe you out. He sees you as a threat to everything that he does. So let's form a covenant together, a promise-keeping, a commitment. And out of that will come this trust and this loyalty that we will have for each other. And here's the covenant. I'm going to die. God's told me that I'm going to die. You're going to be the king. When I die, I would like you to promise that you will take care of all of my descendants on my behalf because of our relationship, because of our covenant, and because of our loyalty and our trust. And David said, I will do that for you, Jonathan. And then David flees south into the wilderness. And Jonathan retraces his steps back to the holy city, to the capital of Jerusalem, through the gate of the city, into the palace, and assumes his place back in the court of Saul. They are never, ever again to see each other. Each will follow their own destiny from here on out, remembering the promises and the covenants which they have made to each other. So the book of Samuel ends on the battlefield. Saul realizes that he is going to be killed, so he falls on his sword. Jonathan is killed in battle. And when he is killed, the people assume that the household of Saul is over. It's done. The throne of Saul is finished. There is no one left. It's extinguished. There's no one to wear the crown or to sit on the throne. Sort of. Let's pick this up in the next passage of Samuel. 2 Samuel 4:4, we read, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was a cripple in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. That's where the battle was. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. In the midst of this battle, Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, is taken by his nurse to flee from the palace and from the enemy. She's going down a set of stairs, stone stairs. In her haste, she drops the child. The child falls on his back and is paralyzed from the waist down. He's a cripple. His back has been crushed. He'll never, ever again walk. That's the last we hear of him. And so now, let's allow this story to unfold and see what David does in this good story and bad story with his kingship and with this long-lost son of Jonathan. The first thing that David does is that he remembers the promise. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. And David said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness, Keseth, for Jonathan's sake? Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is a cripple in his feet. 15 years pass. Jonathan has died in battle. God has established the throne and the kingdom of David. It is the golden age of Israel. And at some point, 15 years later, David remembers this promise that he had made to Jonathan. And he asks, is there anyone of the house of Jonathan? Did anybody survive the battle? Ziba is the servant of David. He was also the servant of Saul, so he knows the whole story. And Ziba knows the custom, and the custom is that when you have a new king, when a new king would take over, he would destroy all the family of the original king, the preceding king, so that there would be no threat or no danger to his throne or to his crown. So Ziba doesn't really know what to say to David when David asks, is there anyone left of the house of Jonathan? Because he assumes that if there is anyone and that person is found, that they will be put to death. So he says, well, yeah, there's Mephibosheth, but he's just a cripple. That's all. He's a son of Jonathan, but he's a cripple. Ziba wants to avert his death. He doesn't want to get him into trouble with David. So he says he's lame. His legs are crushed. He can't walk. He has no feet. He's no threat to you, David. No threat whatsoever. And David does what God does when he remembers this promise. David does what God does for you and me. And as we look at this story, I want you to understand that there's two scenes taking place here. There's this actual story of David and Mephibosheth and Jonathan. And then there's the story of you and me and God being acted out and lived out in the story of David and Mephibosheth. So David remembers his promise. 15 years later, he remembers. And the next thing he does when he finds out that there is someone left is that he seeks him out. He searches for him. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 4 reads these words, and the king said to him, where is he? Ziba said to the king, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo Davar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo Davar. Where is he? Where is he? He is at Lo davar. Lo in the Hebrew means no, davar means word. He is in a place of no word. He is in a place of desolation. He's in a place that time forgot. He's in a place where outcasts and criminals live. He's no threat to you whatsoever. He's hiding in squalor. He's eating the scraps from the table of a man by the name of Makir, who can't have too much money himself because he lives in Lo-Devar. He's an absolute nobody living in an absolute nobody place. He is no threat to you, David, whatsoever. And David sent for him. Now, remember, he's hiding out there, and I'm sure that his nurse, the nurse that dropped him, that was responsible for him being a cripple, I am sure she told him every single day, now, watch out for David. Don't go back to the capital city. Don't be seen. Don't be known. Hide out here. Because if David finds out that you're alive, he's going to come to get you, and he's going to want to kill you. And then one day, on the horizon, they see these great horses with these great warriors. They immediately know it is the soldiers from the house. They are the soldiers from the house of David, from his army, and they have come to seek out Mephibosheth. Only Mephibosheth, he can't run. He can't flee. His fate is hopeless. He is a cripple. He is paralyzed. He is stuck. There is no way out for him. The soldiers come, they lay hands on him. They probably put him on some kind of pallet or some kind of mat, and they make off with him. And he knows they're headed toward the capital city of Jerusalem, through the gates, into the palace, into the court of David himself. That's where we read these words in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 6. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. He is brought into the court room of David, and he falls on the floor before the king. His heart's beating. He's gasping for breath. And David looks at him and he says, Mephibosheth. Now, can you imagine what Mephibosheth is thinking at this particular moment? Oh, no. He knows my name. He knows who I am. He knows where I came from. He knows I am the son of Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. So Mephibosheth says, behold, your servant. I'm nobody, David. I've been living in the land of Lo-Devar. I'm a cripple. I'm no threat to you. And so the question becomes, what does David do? What does he do with him? Well, David does what God does for us, for those who live in the land of Lo-Devar. So David remembers a promise, and David seeks him out. And finally, David fully restores him. Fully restores him. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7. And David said to him, do not fear. People in the Bible are always saying, don't fear, don't fear. You know, the angel came to the women at the resurrection and said, don't be afraid. It's okay. God is a kind God. He is a gracious God. He is a loving God. He is a steadfast God. It's okay. It's okay. Do not fear. For I will show you kindness, chesed, loyalty, trust, for the sake, on behalf of, your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. This is absolutely stunning. Don't be afraid. Because of your father Jonathan, on his behalf, for his sake, I want you to remember those words, on his behalf or for his sake. Because of a promise that Jonathan and I made, because of our love for each other, our affection and devotion, because of the trust and the loyalty that we have for one another, you're okay. I'm going to restore you. I'm going to go to great lengths to give you back 4 times what you lost. 4 times the kingdom of Saul. David is going to do for him what God does for us, to completely, fully restore far beyond his possible imagination. He's going to receive his inheritance, the one that he thought he had lost. He is going to sit at the table of a king. This imagery of sitting at David's table, this cripple from the land of Lo-Devar, this nobody from nowhere, sitting at the table of a king. I love this word. It says, always, always, always. You sit at my table like a king on behalf of another. Now, this is where the Bible really, really, really gets good. It's where Scripture gets on top of Scripture. I want to take you now to Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. One of the most important verses in the New Testament. And in this passage, we read these words: Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, on behalf of us. For it is written that cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. Galatians 3:13. You know, Luther translated Galatians in 1517, really started the Reformation. He said it's probably the most significant book. If he were caught on a desert island and only had one book of the Bible to have with him, it would be the book of Galatians. It's a summary of the whole Bible. And here in verse 13 of chapter 3, we find a summary of the whole book. And in there is a preposition, for us. It's hyper in the Greek. It's one of the most important words in the New Testament. For us, on behalf of us, something took place. Someone took our place and did something so that we could be restored. Jesus, in his death on the cross, was hyper. He did what we were supposed to do, to die on a cross. He made a payment for that which we couldn't pay. He paid a debt which we didn't have enough to pay back. He suffered on a cross for you and me. He did what you and I can't do, redeemed ourselves before God on the basis of a berith, a covenant and a promise. He promised to do this. He promised he would do this for you and me, that he would become our curse on the cross. We live hyper. We live on behalf of what he did, on the basis of a covenant and a promise, not based on anything we do, but what he did. Hyper. This is the message of the gospel, that God makes a promise, then God seeks us out, you and me. We don't seek him out. We don't find God. God finds us. We're not looking for God, but God is looking for us. He's searching for us like the woman searched for the lost coin, like the father searched for the prodigal son who had left him. He seeks us out. He is looking for us. And when he finds us, he restores us. David does what he doesn't have to do, and God does what he doesn't have to do on the basis of his grace. John Wesley said it was his amazing grace that makes provision for us to restore us to a seat at his table. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be flawless. All we have to do is come in grace and receive God's grace. We only have to say, yeah, I'm a cripple. Yeah, I come from the land of Lo-Devar. Yeah, I'm nobody when it comes to God. Yeah, but he knows my name. He knows my name. He knows who I am. He knows everything about me. And he says to me, if you will say those words of Mephibosheth, I will be your servant. I embrace you. I cling to you. I rely upon you. I depend upon your mercy. I depend upon your kindness. I am fully dependent upon your grace. to save me at this moment, then God graciously, quickly redeems and restores us so that we can sit at his table forever. God is in the business of redemption and restoration. And so we read in the last verse of this story, so Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now, just as a reminder, Samuel writes and concludes, now he was lame in both of his feet. Can you see him sitting at that table, a cripple? Lame in both feet? My guess is that part of David's heart, part of David's grace and understanding here, was that David knew that Jonathan sacrificed himself for David. Grace always affects our lives and produces more grace. My guess here is that David is saying, Mephibosheth, I'm a cripple. We're both cripples. I know enough and have seen enough and have been through enough of life to know that I come from the land of Lo Devar. I come from being nobody, a shepherd boy in the fields, to the golden age of Israel. I don't deserve this. I didn't earn it. I don't merit it. It was given to me by grace. And so I give to you by grace. Sought you out to redeem you and to restore you. And so I have an image. Mephibosheth sits at the table of David all of his life, and he eats from his table like a king. And when he dies, there's a tombstone put over his grave, and it says these words, Mephibosheth, a cripple, redeemed and restored by God, by God's grace. What a tombstone. What an epitaph. What a legacy. It's the story of the gospel. This is why Jesus is the ultimate overcomer, you see. This life of David, the story of David, this life of overcoming is all because of the ultimate overcomer of life. And that's who I desperately want you to come to know. God's Son, Jesus Christ, by faith, to admit and own our failures and trust on him alone by grace for our salvation, our restoration. And when we do that, God promises through this ultimate overcomer, God's Son, Jesus Christ, he promises that we will sit at the table of the King forever. Can you imagine sitting in heaven, sitting at the table of God himself, the Father, and eating of his table and of his food as if we were kings ourselves? You see, when we come to know the ultimate overcomer, we come to know who we are, we come to know where we came from, and we come to know where we're headed, what our ultimate destination in life will be. We live hyper on behalf of another. So remember this ultimate overcomer. He remembers his promises. He searches and seeks out his people. And he restores us and invites us to sit and live and eat at the table of a king forever.